It is just after 4 in the morning on the 1st of May, 1982. 8,000 miles from London, somewhere in the vast black emptiness of the South Atlantic, a single Avro Vulcan bomber is wallowing through the darkness at 26,000 feet. Its crew of 5 have been crammed into a cramped, sweat-soaked cockpit for very nearly 8 hours. They are exhausted. They are frightened. And they are about to do something no British aircraft has done since the Second World War. Drop bombs in anger on an enemy-held airfield. The aircraft is a relic. The Vulcan was designed in the late 1940s to carry Britain's nuclear deterrent over the Soviet Union. By 1982, it was weeks away from retirement, a graceful, aging delta-winged ghost from another era. Nobody had ever seriously imagined sending one to bomb a runway at the very bottom of the world. Yet here it was, fuel gauges dropping, crew nerves fraying, bearing down on Port Stanley Aerodrome on a captured British island. To get this far, the bomber has already been refueled in mid-air 5 times. Behind it, and ahead of it, and tangled across the night sky in a desperate aerial ballet, are no fewer than 11 Victor tanker aircraft, almost the entire surviving fleet, passing fuel from one to another in a chain of staggering complexity. One mistake, one missed coupling, one miscalculation of arithmetic scribbled on a navigator's knee-pad, and the whole mission collapses into the sea. The captain is Flight Lieutenant Martin Withers, a man who, only a fortnight earlier, had no idea he would be flying the longest range bombing raid in the history of aerial warfare. The code word for the operation is Black Buck. And the men flying it have been told, in the bluntest possible terms, that some of them may not be coming home. Why was Britain doing this? Why send a clapped-out nuclear bomber on a 14.5-hour round trip, the longest combat mission ever flown to that point, to drop 21,000-pound bombs on a strip of tarmac in the Falkland Islands? What could possibly justify the sheer expense, the risk, the near impossible logistics of it all? The answer lies in something far larger than a single runway. It lies in a humiliated government in Whitehall, a Royal Navy task force steaming south into mortal danger, and a calculation about fear, about what a single bomb, dropped against all the odds, might do to the mind of an enemy general sitting in Buenos Aires. Because Black Buck was never really about cratering a runway. The military value of those bombs has been argued over for 40 years. The raids were about something more subtle and more British. A message. A demonstration that the long arm of the Royal Air Force could reach anywhere on Earth. That no Argentine city was beyond its grasp. And that the Vulcans, which had spent 30 years on alert to obliterate Moscow, could just as easily appear over Buenos Aires. It was bluff and brilliance in equal measure. It was held together by slide rules, by improvisation, by men welding refueling probes back onto airframes that hadn't carried them in a decade. And it stretched the Royal Air Force to the absolute limit of what was physically possible. This is the story of how a nation, caught flat-footed and embarrassed on the world stage, reached back into its Cold War arsenal and flung a single bomber across half the globe. It is a story of engineering miracles, appalling weather, and one of the most audacious gambles in modern military history. And it begins, as so many of these stories do, with a telephone ringing in the dead of night. And a prime minister who had absolutely no intention of letting a far-flung corner of the empire be taken without a fight. To understand Black Buck, you must first understand the Britain of 1982, a country uncertain of its place in the world, and a government fighting for its life. Margaret Thatcher had been in Downing Street for almost 3 years, and they had been brutal ones. Unemployment had climbed past 3 million. Inflation, though falling, had savaged household budgets. Riots had torn through Brixton and Toxteth the previous summer. The monetarist medicine the Prime Minister had forced down the nation's throat was deeply unpopular, and her personal approval ratings were among the lowest ever recorded for a sitting premier. Whitehall mandarins whispered that she might be a one-term leader. The Britain of the early 1980s felt, to many, like a nation in managed decline, its industries shrinking, its cities decaying, its global role a fading memory of imperial grandeur. The armed forces reflected that mood of retreat. John Nott, the Defence Secretary, had spent the previous year drawing up swinging cuts. His 1981 Defence Review fell hardest on the Royal Navy. The ice patrol ship HMS Endurance, Britain's only permanent naval presence in the South Atlantic, was marked for withdrawal. Aircraft carriers were to be sold off. The whole strategic posture was tilting away from the blue water, globe-spanning navy of old, and towards a narrower role in NATO's defence of the European mainland against the Soviet threat. To the generals in Buenos Aires, this looked like a green light. The military junta, led by General Leopoldo Galtieri, governed a country in economic chaos, racked by inflation and haunted by the dirty war in which thousands of its own citizens had simply disappeared. Galtieri needed a distraction, a nationalist cause to rally a furious population. The Malvinas, as the Argentines called the Falklands, were perfect. A long-standing territorial grievance, a cluster of windswept islands 8,000 miles from Britain and barely 400 from Argentina, populated by fewer than 2,000 British subjects and a great many more sheep. The Foreign Office had seen the danger signs. Successive British governments, frankly, had wished the Falklands problem would quietly go away. There had been talk in years past of a leaseback arrangement, of negotiating away sovereignty. But the islanders were fiercely, immovably British, and Parliament had no appetite for handing them over. So the matter festered. When Argentine forces stormed ashore on the 2nd of April 1982 and overwhelmed the tiny Royal Marines garrison at Port Stanley, Britain was caught utterly off guard. The humiliation was total. A NATO power, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, a nation that still thought of itself as a global player, had allowed a piece of its sovereign territory to be seized by a South American dictatorship. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, resigned within days, taking responsibility for the intelligence failure. In the House of Commons, the mood was incandescent. Members on all sides demanded action. Thatcher, who might have been finished by the debacle, instead saw with absolute clarity that her premiership now hung on the response. She convened a small war cabinet. She summoned the First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Henry Leach, who arrived at the Commons still in his uniform, and told her bluntly that the Navy could assemble a task force and retake the islands, and that Britain must, or it would no longer count for anything in the world. It was decided. A task force would sail south. But the Falklands lay at the very edge of what British power could reach. The nearest friendly staging post was Ascension Island, a speck of volcanic rock in the mid-Atlantic, itself nearly 4,000 miles from the war zone. Any aircraft attempting to strike the islands from there faced a journey of almost unimaginable length. And that, in the planning rooms of the Royal Air Force, is where a seemingly impossible idea began to take shape. The man who would have to make the impossible possible was Air Marshal Sir John Curtis, the officer placed in charge of air operations for the campaign. But the truly pressing problem landed first on the desks of Strike Command at High Wycombe, where planners stared at maps and did some grim arithmetic. The Falklands lay 3,886 miles from Ascension Island. A Vulcan's combat radius on internal fuel was nothing remotely close to that. To reach Port Stanley and return, a single bomber would need to be refueled in the air again and again and again. And the RAF's tanker fleet, the venerable Handley Page Victors, were themselves limited in range. The only way to push one bomber to the target was to launch a great swarm of tankers, refueling not just the Vulcan, but each other, peeling away in sequence as their fuel was passed forward. It was a logistical puzzle of extraordinary difficulty, and at first glance it looked unsolvable. There was a deeper problem still. The Vulcan, for all its Cold War pedigree, was in no fit state for the job. The fleet was being wound down. Crucially, the aircraft's air-to-air refueling system had fallen into disuse years before. The probes were corroded, the plumbing neglected, and most crews had never practiced taking on fuel in flight. Engineers had to scour museums, scrapyards, and even a bomber mounted as a gate guardian to find serviceable, refueling probes. They worked round the clock, cannibalizing parts, coaxing 30-year-old systems back to life. Then there was the matter of the bombs themselves. A Vulcan could carry 21 1,000-pound bombs in its cavernous bomb bay. The very weapon load it had been built to deliver, in conventional form, in another era. But the navigation and bombing computers were antiques, designed for high-level nuclear delivery, not precision attacks on a runway. The crews would have to relearn, almost from scratch, the art of conventional bombing their predecessors had practiced over Germany 4 decades earlier. A handful of squadrons were hurriedly chosen, their crews thrown into intensive training. They practiced air-to-air refueling by day and night, fighting the bucking, skittish behavior of a heavy bomber jostling for position behind a tanker. Several pilots found it terrifying. Withers and his fellow captains drilled relentlessly, knowing that a single fumble contact in the dark, over the ocean, could be fatal. Across the water, the Argentine occupiers were digging in. They had flown combat aircraft and transport planes into Port Stanley's single hard runway. And there was a real fear in London that they might base fast jets, Mirages, Skyhawks, perhaps even super etendards armed with the deadly Exocet missile, on the islands themselves. If the Argentines could operate high-performance fighters from Stanley, the approaching British task force, with its small and precious force of Sea Harriers, would be in grave peril. Denying the enemy the use of that runway became a genuine strategic objective, not merely a gesture. But there was a second, quieter objective, understood at the highest levels in Whitehall. If a Vulcan could reach Port Stanley, then by extension it could reach the Argentine mainland. The junta knew it. And the psychological effect of demonstrating that reach, of forcing Argentina to hold back fighters for home defense rather than committing them to the Falklands, might prove worth far more than any crater in a runway. So the plan crystallized. A lone Vulcan, supported by a vast aerial convoy of tankers, would fly from Ascension to the Falklands, bomb the runway at Port Stanley, and return. It would be the longest range bombing raid ever attempted. The code name chosen for the operation was Black Buck. The crews were given their orders. The tankers were marshalled on Ascension's crowded apron. And on the evening of the 30th of April, 1982, the first of the great Vulcans rolled towards the runway, heavy with fuel and bombs into the gathering dark. The first attempt nearly ended before it began. The Vulcans selected as primary aircraft suffered a cabin pressurization fault almost immediately after takeoff. A window seal that simply would not hold. At high altitude, an unpressurized cabin would be lethal. The captain had no choice but to turn back. And here the genius of the planners revealed itself. There was a reserve. A second Vulcan, XM607, captained by Martin Withers, was already airborne as the backup. In an instant, the entire weight of the operation shifted onto his shoulders. Withers and his crew had expected to escort the mission part way and return. Now they were going all the way. Ahead of them lay nearly 8 hours of flight, 5 or 6 in-flight refuelings, an enemy-held target bristling with anti-aircraft guns and radar-guided missiles, and then the whole exhausting journey home again, assuming there was any fuel left to make it. The refueling plan was a thing of baroque complexity. 11 Victor tankers launched alongside the bombers, the whole armada thundering off Ascension's runway into the night, within minutes of one another. The choreography was merciless. Tankers refueled other tankers, then turned for home, their fuel transferred forward down the chain like a relay of runners passing a baton. The mathematics had to be perfect. Every gallon was accounted for. And the weather, that great enemy of all such plans, refused to cooperate. Somewhere over the mid-Atlantic, the formation flew into a towering tropical storm. The aircraft pitched and rolled in violent turbulence, and the delicate business of pushing a refueling probe into a drogue basket, difficult enough in calm air, became a white-knuckle ordeal. During one critical transfer between two Victors, the turbulence snapped a refueling probe clean off. The tanker involved was suddenly unable to receive fuel. The carefully balanced equation of the entire mission threatened to unravel then and there. The crews improvised with breathtaking sang-froid. Fuel plans were hastily rewritten in the air. One Victor captain, squadron leader Bob Tuxford, found himself facing an agonizing dilemma. To pass enough fuel forward to the Vulcan to let it reach the target, he would have to give away so much of his own that he might not make it back to Ascension. He would be left over a freezing, empty ocean with his tanks running dry, gambling that another tanker could be scrambled to find him on the return leg. Tuxford made his choice. He passed the fuel. He committed himself and his crew to a desperate hope, all so that one bomber could carry on towards a runway 8,000 miles from home. It was an act of cold, calculated courage that has never received the recognition it deserves. Now, XM607 pressed on alone. The last tanker peeled away into the darkness, and Withers's Vulcan was on its own, descending towards the South Atlantic and the enemy coast. The crew ran through their attack checklist. They armed the bombs. They dropped to low level to slip beneath the Argentine radar, the great delta wing skimming over the black water before climbing again for the bombing run. In the cockpit, the tension was almost unbearable. The navigators hunched over equipment designed to drop a single nuclear weapon on a Soviet city, now repurposed to scatter 21 conventional bombs across a Falklands runway at a precise diagonal angle, calculated to guarantee that at least one would strike home. Ahead, in the darkness, lay Port Stanley. The Argentine garrison slept, or stood half alert, with no conception that a British bomber had just crossed half the planet to find them. The radar warning receivers in the Vulcan's tail began to register enemy emissions. The target was close now. Withers steadied the aircraft for the run-in. And then the bomb doors opened. At precisely 7 minutes past 4 in the morning, local time, on the 1st of May, 1982, 21 1,000-pound bombs tumbled from the belly of XM607 in a single, juddering stick. The crew felt the aircraft leap upwards, suddenly lightened of its 10-ton load. Withers hauled the Vulcan into a hard climbing turn, throwing the great delta around the sky to put distance between his aircraft and the inevitable response. Below and behind them, the bombs were falling in a long diagonal line across Port Stanley Aerodrome, the angle carefully calculated so that even with the imprecision of those antique bomb sights, the stick would walk across the runway and at least one bomb would crater the tarmac. For a few seconds, Nothing. Then the first bomb struck, and the night below erupted. To the Argentine defenders on the ground, it was utterly without warning. One moment, silence and darkness over the occupied airfield. The next, a string of thunderous explosions marching across the base, hurling earth, tarmac, and debris into the sky, the concussions rolling out across the harbour. Men flung themselves into trenches. Anti-aircraft gunners scrambled to their weapons and hurled tracer blindly up into the black, firing at an enemy they could neither see nor comprehend. Where had this come from? There were no British aircraft carriers within range, or so they believed. The task force was still far to the northeast, and yet bombs were falling on Port Stanley. One bomb struck the runway almost dead center, gouging an enormous crater out of the tarmac. The others marched away across the airfield, cratering soft ground, destroying stores, damaging equipment, and badly rattling the garrison's nerves. The single hit on the runway was the prize. It was not enough to close the airfield to the propeller-driven transport aircraft the Argentines used to resupply the islands. They would patch and repair it within days, but it was more than enough to ensure that Stanley could never safely operate the fast jets that London feared most. No Mirage, no Skyhawk would risk a takeoff run down a runway pocked with bomb damage and the constant threat of more raids to come. Withers and his crew did not linger to admire their work. The Vulcan clawed for altitude and turned north, transmitting the single prearranged code word that signaled a successful attack. Superfuse, back to the anxious planners on Ascension and in Whitehall. But the danger was far from over. The bomber had expended enormous quantities of fuel reaching the target. Now it had to find a tanker over the empty ocean in daylight to have any hope of getting home. The return leg was its own ordeal. The rendezvous with the homebound victor was a fraught, fuel-critical affair, the Vulcan's tanks running perilously low as the crew strained to make contact. When at last the probe slid home and fuel began to flow, there was relief, but no celebration. They were still hours from safety, drained beyond exhaustion, the adrenaline of the attack curdling into bone-deep fatigue. Behind them, Bob Tuxford's gamble had paid off. His near-empty Victor, having given away its fuel reserves, was found by an emergency tanker and nursed back to Ascension. The whole improbable machine had held together. 15 hours and 45 minutes after it had lumbered into the air, XM607 touched down at Ascension. Martin Withers climbed stiffly from the cockpit, having flown the longest-range bombing mission in the history of warfare to that date, and lived. The crews were debriefed, congratulated, and in some cases simply allowed to sleep. But the question lingered, even in the moment of triumph. Had it actually been worth it? 21 bombs, one cratered runway, and an entire RAF tanker fleet pushed to breaking point. Was that the measure of success, or was the real target somewhere else entirely? Let us be honest about the ledger, because the Black Buck raids have divided historians and airmen alike for 4 decades. In purely material terms, the cost was staggering and the return modest. Each Black Buck mission consumed prodigious quantities of fuel. Well over £1 million of it ferried south by the entire surviving Victor tanker fleet. It tied up dozens of aircraft and hundreds of personnel to deliver, on the first raid, a single bomb hit on a runway that the Argentines repaired within 48 hours. There would be further Black Buck raids over the following weeks. 7 were planned, 5 actually flown to completion, some targeting the runway again, others using American-supplied Shrike anti-radar missiles to attack Argentine radar installations. Their cumulative physical damage was, by any sober assessment, limited. Critics, then and now have called the raids a colossal waste of resources. An extravagant piece of theatre that achieved little that the Royal Navy's Sea Harriers and ships' guns could not have managed at a fraction of the cost. The Harriers, after all, struck Stanley with cluster munitions later that same morning and continued to harass it throughout the campaign. Why throw a 30-year-old strategic bomber across the planet for one hole in a runway? But this accounting misses the point, and the men in Whitehall and Buenos Aires understood it perfectly. The true target of Black Buck was never the tarmac. It was the mind of the Argentine High Command. By demonstrating that the RAF could place bombs on Port Stanley, Britain proved beyond argument that the same Vulcans could reach Buenos Aires, Cordoba, or any Argentine city. The junta could not be certain it was a bluff. And so, in the days after the first raid, the Argentine Air Force pulled a substantial portion of its precious Mirage 3 interceptors back to defend the mainland against a strategic bombing threat that, in truth, Britain had little intention of carrying out. That single decision may have been worth the entire operation. Those mirages, had they been committed over the Falklands, might have tipped the desperately fine air balance against the Sea Harriers, whose pilots were already outnumbered and fighting at the very limit of their endurance. Every Argentine fighter held back for home defence was one fewer threat to the ships carrying Britain's soldiers south. In the brutal calculus of the campaign, a psychological victory translated directly into British lives saved at sea and on the beachheads. There was a cost in pride and in machinery too. The raids exposed, in the most public way imaginable, just how far Britain's once global reach had withered. A nation that had bombed Germany by the 1,000-bomber stream in 1944 could now, in 1982, scrape together a single bomber for a single target only by emptying its entire tanker fleet and welding probes scavenged from museum pieces. The triumph was real, but it was also a sobering measure of decline, a reminder of how thin the margins of British power had become. And yet the raids taught Whitehall and the RAF hard, valuable lessons. The campaign exposed glaring deficiencies in Britain's air-to-air refueling capacity, in long-range strike, in the very ability to project power beyond the European theatre that the knot cuts had so cheerfully discounted. Within a remarkably short time, the RAF was converting more aircraft into tankers and rethinking its assumptions about expeditionary warfare. The lessons of the South Atlantic would echo through British defence planning for a generation, shaping the force that would later deploy to the Gulf and beyond. The bill had been paid. The question now was what Britain had bought with it, and whether the gamble had truly shifted the war. The Black Buck raids did not win the Falklands War. No single operation did. The islands were retaken the hard way, by Royal Marines and paratroopers yomping across cold, sodden moorland, by the guns of the Royal Navy, by the desperate dogfights of Sea Harrier pilots, and by the appalling sacrifice at places like Goose Green and Mount Longdon. By the 14th of June, 1982, Argentine forces in Port Stanley had surrendered, and the Union Jack flew once more over the islands. But Black Buck had played its part, and its influence rippled outwards in ways both immediate and lasting. In the short term, the psychological effect on the Argentine command proved real and durable. The withdrawal of Mirage interceptors to defend the mainland eased the pressure on the outnumbered Sea Harrier force at a crucial moment. Argentine commanders, knowing that British bombers had reached Stanley once, could never entirely discount the threat to their own cities, and that uncertainty shaped their dispositions for the rest of the war. A handful of bombs had achieved a strategic distraction out of all proportion to their explosive power. For Margaret Thatcher, the wider victory was transformative. The gamble of sending the task force south, derided by some as reckless when she ordered it, had paid off completely. The woman whose premiership had seemed doomed in the spring of 1982 emerged by the summer as a national figurehead, the Iron Lady who had refused to accept the loss of British territory and had reversed it by force of arms. The Falklands factor carried her to a landslide general election victory the following year. Few military gambles in modern British history have had such direct and decisive domestic political consequences. For the Royal Air Force, Black Buck became a point of fierce pride and a hard lesson. The Vulcan, retired only weeks after the war, had gone out not with a whimper, but with one final, extraordinary flourish, the longest bombing raids in history, flown by an aircraft built for a war that never came. The operation also forced an urgent reappraisal of Britain's air refuelling and long-range strike capabilities. The hurried conversions and improvisations of 1982 gave way to a more deliberate investment in tanker aircraft and expeditionary capability, lessons that would serve Britain well in the conflicts of the coming decades. There was a diplomatic dimension too, and here the special relationship told. Behind the scenes, the United States had quietly assisted the British effort, providing fuel at Ascension, supplying the Shrike anti-radar missiles used in the later raids, and offering intelligence and equipment that smoothed the campaign's path. Publicly, Washington had performed an awkward balancing act between its NATO ally and its hemispheric interests in Latin America. But in practice, when it mattered, the Americans came down on Britain's side. The episode reaffirmed, after the strains of the 1970s, that the alliance forged in the Second World War still held real weight. And for the wider world, the Falklands Campaign, Black Buck included, sent a message that reverberated far beyond the South Atlantic. Here was a tired, declining European power, written off by many as a spent force that had nonetheless reached 8,000 miles across the globe to recover its sovereign territory by arms. It was a demonstration of will as much as capability. To a Soviet Union watching from Moscow, and to allies and adversaries alike, it suggested that Britain, and by extension the Western Alliance, still had teeth, and the resolve to use them. The Vulcans returned to their hangars, and then to the breakers' yard and the museums. But the legend of their final mission was only just beginning to take shape. 4 decades on, the Black Buck raids occupy a curious and cherished place in the British imagination. They are remembered not so much for what they destroyed as for what they represented: ingenuity, improvisation, and a refusal to accept that something simply could not be done. The numbers still astonish. A round trip of nearly 8,000 miles, 15 hours and 45 minutes in the air on the first raid. As many as 18 aircraft committed to put a single bomber over a single target. A tanker fleet pushed to the absolute edge of its capacity, passing fuel hand to hand across the breadth of the Atlantic. Until the American B-52 missions of the Gulf War nearly a decade later, Black Buck stood unchallenged as the longest-range bombing operation ever mounted. For sheer audacity of conception, it has few equals in the history of air warfare. But the deeper legacy lies in what the raids reveal about Britain itself. Here was a nation that by 1982 had spent the better part of 40 years managing its retreat from empire and global power. Its fleet was shrinking. Its bombers were museum pieces. Its confidence was battered. And yet, when its territory was seized, it found within its diminished arsenal the means and the will to strike back across half the planet. The Vulcan that bombed Port Stanley had been built to deter Armageddon over the plains of Central Europe. That it should end its career cratering a runway in the South Atlantic is one of the great ironies and triumphs of British military history. There is something quintessentially British about the whole affair. The make do and mend spirit of engineers scavenging refueling probes from gate guardians. The quiet, unsung heroism of a tanker captain like Bob Tuxford, gambling his crew's lives on a maths problem over a freezing ocean. The dry understatement of airmen who flew the impossible and then queued for a cup of tea. It is the same spirit that animated the Battle of Britain, the dambusters, the beaches of Dunkirk, the conviction that with enough cleverness and enough nerve, the odds can be beaten. Was it worth it? The debate will never be fully settled, and perhaps that is fitting. By the cold ledger of bombs dropped and craters made, Black Buck was extravagant for its returns. By the measure of psychological impact, of fighters drawn back to defend the mainland, of a message sent to a watching world, it may have been one of the shrewdest operations of the entire campaign. History rarely offers clean answers, and the Black Buck raids resist them more than most. What is beyond dispute is that five-man crews in aging aircraft did something that had never been done before and has rarely been matched since. They flew to the very edge of the possible, and they came home. In an age of precision weapons and global reach, it is worth remembering what could be achieved with slide rules, courage, and a 30-year-old Delta-winged bomber that simply refused to be retired before it had one last story to tell. So, what do you make of it? Was Black Buck a stroke of strategic genius, or an expensive piece of theatre that proved Britain's reach more than it changed the war? I'd genuinely like to know where you come down on it. Drop your verdict in the comments below, and let's have the argument out. If you enjoyed this journey to the bottom of the world, do give the video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into Britain's military and Cold War history. There are far stranger and bolder stories still to come, and I'd hate for you to miss them.